Hello, can you hear me?
Hey Jen, hi. Hi, yes,
Hi.
absolutely. I'm just getting the
Good.
live stream ready on YouTube. So,
Wonderful.
okay, here we are. We are live.
Wonderful.
All right. Um, so you saw the Odyssey?
I did see the Odyssey, and I have to say, I was so surprised. I
Really,
just went
positively or
in
negatively?
positively. I went in apprehensive because, of course, all the hullabaloo about the casting choices, and then some people were murmuring about the costume choices and everything. And I just thought, okay, I don't know what this is going to be like, but gosh, I was actually blown away. I thought it was very well done. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it. I really am.
Yeah, and I've had a chance to hear some of your thoughts, but I don't know if you want to expound on anything that you've been thinking since you posted the initial reaction.
I don't want to go too much in depth with it because I really do want to
Sure.
spend time with Gatto today, but um, in general, right now, I am in a sardonic mood because I'm seeing so many different critics who are criticizing the movie for this, that, or the other. And the
Oh,
arguments are just, I don't know, I find them ridiculous, and
okay.
so I'm making satire right now. Like I reviewed Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses, but I reviewed it as a sort of like he's miscast everybody and he's rewritten this script and he's not really doing Homer because that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing a lot of this. And I'm like, look, if you had any education, you recognize that Homer
Mhm.
isn't the end all and be all of the Odyssey. Yeah, he writes the greatest epic of Odysseus ever, no doubt about it.
Mhm.
But there have been numerous reinterpretations as early as Euripides reinterpreting in the Trojan War, the Trojan women
Mhm.
or women of Troy. And you see that in
Yes.
Philoctetes, right? Also, Philoctetes is
Mhm.
a play by Sophocles, and you see that in other plays that are written during the classical period. Then you see Virgil redoing it. Then you see Dante redoing it. Then you see Shakespeare redoing it.
Yes.
Then you see Tennyson redoing it. It's over and over. Nobody
Yes.
ever like tries to take
Mhm.
Homer and redo the entire bloody epic exactly as Homer did. That's silly. I mean, if you're going to
Mhm.
do that, go back and read the epic.
Mhm. Yeah.
But this whole thing about word to screen irks
Mhm.
me because I think that a lot of people that want that don't recognize that screen is a different medium. It's a different medium than the written word. And it's a different medium even than the spoken word. So just as music is a different medium than the written word, um, screen is a different medium than the music and written word themselves. In fact, as Aristotle points out in the Poetics, it's a combination of the written, the visual, the music, and the spectacle. And all those things combine in a stage play, as he would say, but in a movie, in order to create something different than just the written word. So I don't know. I just get irked by a lot of the arguments right now. They just seem to me ludicrous. But I saw it twice now. I've seen the movie twice. I'll see it
Oh,
three
okay.
times. I will see it three times by Friday.
Wow.
And I can't say enough good things about it personally. I just think it's phenomenal. But I'm not going to go and argue against people that are wanting to come in fists flying in order to beat up every trans person in the universe. I'm not going to argue against them because they already have a personal vendetta that they want to put forward, and they have a living they have to make off of strumming up the ire of their followers. So
Yes. Well, I think that's wise. Know your audience and know your opponent and all that. But
yeah,
it
yeah,
is interesting to me what you said about people with any education. And I think it also, people with any understanding, which is different from knowledge, right, of history, um, to know that Homer as a bard, or even his characters or the bards themselves in that time period, would be so adept with their stories that they could alter it or
yes,
draw different elements out to suit the
yeah,
audience that they were speaking to. And
yeah.
just knowing that one tiny thing can be so helpful for something like an adaptation like this. To then ask the question, you see differences and you've noticed differences, well done, good job. Now ask why and what kind they
Yes,
are,
yes, right.
right? what
Right.
kind of difference is this? Is this insipid, dumb, like points to maybe a greater understanding, or is trying to draw out a truth in the text that's already there? So I don't
Yep.
know. I agree with your words for sure.
I think too that one has to, like, when you see any work of art, you have to first try to parse what the artist is saying.
Mm,
And then you evaluate the pieces, and then you evaluate the whole. You can't go into
yes.
any work of art just saying, "Oh, it sucks," and then experience the art, because what you're going to get at the end is that it sucks. And then you won't learn anything. You'll
Mm,
be the same as you were when you went in. And that doesn't seem to me to be at all helpful. I've been very interested to see that certain people on the right, so to speak, have really praised this movie. Spencer Clavin, for instance, and John Pageau, and even Ben Shapiro gave a really positive review for it. I was quite struck by that. He had only one major objection, and it was kind of minor. It was paltry,
mm,
and it was to the Elliot Page character in some ways. But
mm,
the fact that these three guys, who are pretty big names in the conservative world right now, and they're very, very educated guys, very intelligent, leads me to believe that I'm on the right tack, because not one of those guys went in saying this is going to suck because it has miscasting and it has trans people. They didn't say that. Matt Walsh, who did say that, came out saying this is the worst movie ever. I can't believe I wasted 3 hours and it sucks. But
well, that
Matt Walsh was
tracks.
like, "What did you?" Well, I'm glad that you had an open mind. Um,
Yeah. Mhm.
I do think that I think there's a lot to be said too for thinking, okay, if I'm looking at art, I'm looking at one person. Well, technically, it's a whole crew of people, but one person's vision of how the universe should be. And I'm going to say, yes, the universe should be this way, or I'm going to say, no, the universe is not that way, or I'm going to try and allow him to convince me that the universe is this way, I suppose. But what I'm
Mm,
not going to go
mhm.
into is saying, well, I ought to already know what you're saying, and therefore nothing you say will change my mind. Because that just seems to me blockheaded. That's like, well, yeah, that's a pharisaical pre-prejudice to hatred, which, yeah, has never been a good sign ever. I can't
Yeah.
imagine, when Euripides wrote his play, The Trojan Women, it was received with ridicule. People hated it, the older
Yeah.
generation especially. The younger people in Greece loved it. They loved what he did. But they were the hippies, the teenagers, the Utes. Whereas the old seasoned veterans, they're like, "Oh, that guy sucks. He's terrible.
Yeah.
I'm not going to see the play. It sucks, and I know it sucks because I'm not going to see it." um, so yeah, I wonder. I mean, I really wonder at this whole tempest in a teapot thing that's going on. But I think a lot of it is good because it drives people to talk about something they haven't talked about for many years, and it also drives a lot of
Mhm.
people to actually go
Mhm.
and read the translations to see what Homer actually wrote, and that's a good thing. And it drives people to watch idiots like myself who might have something to say. Hey, maybe that
Well,
guy's
there you
worth
go.
listening to. I don't know.
Uh,
Anyway,
yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so yeah, good. I look forward to talking further on Friday about this, and I have right now six people for sure lined up, maybe seven. So it should be a nice crew to think about this and talk about this. Um,
Mm,
I would like to talk about Gatto today because I was reading him this morning and just chuckling. I mean, he's a fun one to
mm,
read. I really enjoy his style. I really enjoy what he has to say. And honestly, he brought to the table something I had never considered before. I mean, I knew about it, but it's like you know
mm,
about something here and you know about something there, but you never make a connection between the two. That's kind of what happened when I was reading this section on the Hindu
mm.
education system. That was really something
Yeah.
else. So I
Well,
thought it
I'm
might be good to go
interested
over.
to sorry, I was just gonna say I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that because um the Hindu that part of history, the British colonization of India and control over there, that is something that is totally like
Oh
I've
yeah.
never read about. I don't know anything
Nope.
about it. I
You
know that
you
it
and most
happened,
Americans.
but
Yep, you
yeah.
and most Americans. And this is not you personally. This is an ubiquitous problem in American education, mine as well, is that we have
Mhm.
all received a primarily an Anglo vision of history. I want to choose my words carefully because I don't want to tick off guys like Bernard Carpenter. Um,
No one wants to
He's a
tick him
good guy, and I
off.
like him. But Bernard, if you're watching, which you should be, don't take this offensively. Don't take this personally. We received a primarily Anglophone, Anglo-centric vision of history, and that's a curated vision of history. And I'm not saying that it's always taught as England, rah, 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 but it frequently went into that England, rah, rah, rah. England is the best, England's the greatest. And that is intentionally done it was intentionally done pre-colonial in order to support the crown. And it's done post-colonial because America derives so much of its origins from England. Consequently, whole swaths of the world are just kind of cut from the educational experience of students. China, for instance, the Middle East, any knowledge of South American and Spanish culture is kind of just excised. And we definitely didn't study things as outrageous as British rapine and conquering, because that would never happen. The British were always right, and so they never raped and conquered.
Yes.
So, and I know it's in some ways it's subversive to talk about that element because history is complicated and sometimes things are nuanced and you have to really wrestle with paradox. And most people don't want that. They just want the basic facts, ma'am, and they want things to confirm what they already think. I'm not saying anybody like in the current situation that I'm dealing with here thinks that, but I think that we are, all of us as humans, pre-wired to want simple answers to things, right? So when you look at an empire like England, which is based upon some pretty good principles, in fact, some of the best principles I think in the West, it may be in humanity, period. Those principles are intertwined with principles that are nefarious. They are principles about human life and human culture, which have always been condemned by um, Christian doctrine, and they normally were condemned by good people prior to Christianity too. William Blake in the early part of the 19th century writes about this extensively. He writes about how England was this tower house of colonialism and industry, and yet at the same time it neglected the poor, it neglected the chimney sweeps, it neglected the widows and the orphans, and the halls ran red with blood, as he said. So he was a very big critic of England, even during the time of the early 19th century. So I don't think it's untoward to accept that a system like Britain and the colonialized system of Britain could be good in a great many principles. It was probably better than most cultures, but it also was intertwined with weeds of nefarious activity and vision. Any more than it is to say about America. America has one of the greatest cultures, I think, in history. Certainly has some of the greatest principles, I think, ever espoused in human culture. But that doesn't negate the fact that there were Americans who wanted to wipe out whole races, or there were Americans who did horrible things, or there were Americans who wanted to abuse their fellow Americans for the sake of capital and industry. The two they're intertwined. And it's like if you take the one out, you destroy the other almost. One of the major paradoxes for me is that the same guy, we all love our park systems in America, the national parks. The guy who pushed for that, Madison Grant, and financed it and backed it, got the bills to create Yosemite National Park and Glacier National Park, not to mention the smaller national parks, is the same guy who wanted to annihilate all of the Italians and the Hungarians on the Eastern Seaboard because they were lesser races. And how do you extract the one from the other? Because the same guy was doing the one at the same time that he was pushing the other. That's a ticklish thing to try and extract, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think one can in some ways. It's almost like you have to hold the paradox, one and the other at the same time. So when we are taught that the Brits invaded India and invaded the Orient and conquered it and dominated it and extracted the wealth of India and of China and beat France, in this massive series of wars that were over opium, and eventually became like the big gangster bosses there in the East. when we read that, do we then say Britain itself is terrible and everything sucks and the West is horrible? I don't think that's the right conclusion. What is the right conclusion is to say, yeah, this bad thing happened. Yes. And many
Mm-hmm.
good things happened simultaneously with it. So anyway, we were never taught that because I think as kids we wouldn't do that. We'd be like, yeah, that sucks, man. The Opium Wars, that was terrible. And Britain sucks, and America sucks, and everything sucks, and
Mhm.
viva la revolution, which is probably not the outcome we want. Anyway, sorry, long
Yeah.
discourse.
So, what you were talking about with the, beating him up and like the gangsters and stuff, right? Britain's activity there in India, that when Gatto was talking about it, he did kind of go through that brief history and he said, Holland or the Dutch were there for a while,
Right.
France had a go at it. And I think, was it Portugal or Spain? One of the two tried as well. Do you know
They
what
did.
India, like what was going on in India before the Europeans showed up? Do you know anything about
I,
that?
I know a little about it, not a great deal. I know that there was this civil war that had occurred, massive civil war that had occurred, and somebody who knows better than I would probably be the person to ask about this. But I know that
Sure.
India had struggled with
Mm.
itself for many years before it became settled.
Mhm.
And I think once it became settled, the ruling class said, we don't want that kind of turmoil. And so was developed this caste system that he talks about. And that lasted
Right.
for
Mhm.
several generations, several hundred years. I don't know how long that lasted, probably back to medieval era. But
Mm.
yeah,
Mhm.
India was fairly stable from what I know up until the
Mhm.
European powers came in, but that was because of that caste system. But I
Sure.
don't know enough to be able to say, and that, talk about lacunas in education.
Mm.
That would be nice to have been taught something of the history of India, but nah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
only just recently learned about the great university of that was in India that was destroyed by the Muslims, and I only recently learned about the ancient cities that are off the coast of Dwarka, and
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm
Those are
learning
cool.
bits and pieces here. Yeah, I'm learning bits and pieces here and
Mhm.
there that it's like, oh, that was nice to know, which makes life very exciting because you're always finding out something new. But on the other hand, it would have been nice to know this when I was younger, you know,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of things. But there it is.
Yeah.
So no, I
Well,
don't really know.
and Gatto's point, I'm trying to find it in the text because I made a note of it, but when he talks about how Hindu schooling came to America, he talks a little bit about Hinduism. And he made it sound like, to me anyway, that it was kind of like a relatively new religion that was like similar. I'm trying to remember. Excuse me for a second.
That's all right. No rush.
He
We're not in a
said
rush.
something. He said something about it had to do with that caste system that you were talking about that was kind
Right.
of implemented in this very Anglican way. Oh, this is what it was. He says the caste system of Hinduism or Brahmanism is the Anglican class system pushed to its imaginative limits.
I thought
And I
that was a
think that was
very
very,
provocative line. Yes. Yes. Here it
yeah.
is. Here
What
it
did
is.
you, what did you think about that?
I think what he's trying to say in a very provocative, because like I wrote here, ouch, right?
Uh huh. Yeah.
That's the line where he says some kind of biological and social link had existed between the all-conquering Aryans, from whom the Hindus had descended, and Anglo-Saxons, which might explain theological similarities between Hinduism and Anglicanism. Like, okay, if you're an Anglican, especially a high Anglican, and you heard that, you're like, oh, oh, mercy, no. You know, no relation between us and those strange people out of the East. No. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that claim, first off, of Arianism, that's the
Yeah.
same claim that is later made by the National Socialists in Germany. The National Socialists, which we call in America Nazis, um,
Yeah.
these Nazis, these naughty Nazis, they were looking for a derivative, a family tree that could prove that they were the master race. And so they went back to they financed all of these digs, archaeological digs, and that was even before the Nazi regime. That was as far back as the Prussian Empire. They were already doing that, but the Nazis financed all these different digs, both in the Middle East and in India, in order to try to find evidence that could connect them, their party, to ancient races that were the dominant class system. And what they found was in India, they found these evidence of people that had been ruling India for years, and a stable class of people that had been ruling India for thousands of years. And those people were at the high levels of this caste system. They were Aryans. And so the Nazi people, the Nazis, the Germanic peoples, drew a link between the Norse peoples and the peoples that had dominated the citizens of the Indus Valley area,
Hmm.
saying that these North people, they came out of the North and they conquered those Indus Valley people and they kept them suppressed in that caste system that they developed. And we are the same people. We are that Norse people, that dominating spirit that is always conquering and improving and ruling class. And by our very DNA, we are destined for being the ruling people of the universe. And that's where they took this symbol, by the way, of the Aryan race, as they called it, the conquering people. The Indian culture had this symbol all over their buildings, which was the hooked cross, the swastika. They took that symbol and they made it the national party symbol to show we are the Aryans, we are descendants of this conquering people. Now, all of this, by the way, was complete, the technical term is bullshit, but nevertheless, it was effective bullshit. It worked. And people rallied around this and say, yay, we have a right to conquer. Let's go do that to the French. And the symbol that they took, which was the hooked cross, the swastika, is actually a symbol of the North Star, of the pole star, because the Indian people, who were great astronomers, kept very close maps of the progress of the stars during the night. And the one single star that keeps its position during the progress is the polar star. And around it are four other stars that was essentially constituted a hooked cross. The four outgoing, they made it a cross shape, and then you had at least two bright ones here and here, and I think there were two ones that were dimmer there and there, so you had that hook shape, and that would progress like a wheel. It was called that by Europeans for years, the Great Wheel or the Great Wain. And earlier religions, like in India, worshipped that as the centrality of the focal point of their religion, not the sun, not the rising sun. That's an Egyptian addition. The Aryan people of the Indus Valley, they worshiped the North Star, and so did the Norse people. They worshipped the North Star, which may have been one of the reasons why they made this connection, or it may be that they made the connection and then they're like, way, yay, they both have the same symbol, but one way or the other, that's what they did. So yeah, there is a connection between Anglicanism, which is that very caste-oriented imagination. God is in his place and all is right in the world. The idea that you have the very wealthy and the good civilized people, and then you have the lower class Bill Bailey types, the Dickensian dwellers of the undergrowth. That system of thought was prevalent in England from I would say pretty much the time of the War of the Roses all the way up until the 19th century, maybe even into the 20th century, because you can see it even in World War I, where all the officers were upper class, and the normal guys in the trenches were normally the poor bastards that had been out there in the coal mines and the like. So anyway, it did dominate English society. So I think he's making a connection here between this very rigid system there in India and then the system where it was difficult to advance in the English system.
Mm-hmm.
A great book to read about this is the fictional work called Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. Jude the Obscure kind of fictionalizes this or embodies it in a fictional setting. So you see elements of it in Jane Austen, certainly, and you see elements of it in the Bronte sisters, but not so starkly outlined as Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, where a poor fella tries to get into higher levels of society, and he just doesn't make it. And he's just a loser. I mean, it's a story about a loser. So if you want to read a story about a
Perfect.
guy who's just a loser, let's do the obscure. Who knows? Maybe someone's into that. Um, but you also see this in the whole English frowning upon people trying to advance their situation, and in the English frowning upon nobility doing any work at all, because they do. This is something Americans have a hard time grasping. The British, even today, think that if you're a noble, you shouldn't have a job. You shouldn't work. Working is demeaning. That's a weird concept for us as Americans,
Yeah.
because we're like, go flip burgers, go mow a lawn, for crying out loud. People that don't know plumbing are losers here in America. But in Britain, even to this day, if you were born into the upper classes, you don't work for a living. You're a part of that upper class.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think there's definitely a connection between the two. And I like the way that he weaves this into his thesis, that the American system is sort of derivative of that English class system business. I think there's
Hmm.
something to it. I think there's something to it. I had not known myself. I mean, I knew about this caste system. And by the way, I found this kind of cool visual. Here, we'll open it up. This is the visual of the caste system as he outlined it. And can you see this here?
Um,
Or
I
do I
see
have
the
to?
little, like the small thumbnail in the corner, but
Okay.
there's just a PDF message right now.
All right, let's do this. We'll stop the share and we'll share this other thing. This is the class system of India here, 5 levels, and the very highest are the Brahmins, priests, and academics, like professors at Yale.
Mm.
I'm going to mispronounce all these words just for the record. So buckle in. The Kshatriyas, the warriors, the administrators or rulers. So these are your, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and those types, Gavin Newsom. That's that type. That's that level. They are warriors and rulers and administrators, just like Tim Walz. Then you get your Vaishyas. The Vaishyas are merchants or tradesmen, farmers, artisans. Those would be people like Bill Gates, maybe, um, people that make a lot of money off of something, and so they've put their money into something else, um, financing movements. And then you have Shudras, who are the commoners or peasants or servants. That's like the lowest class of the upper class, so to speak. The Shudras are the people that have the plumbing jobs and the garbage truck driver jobs and the cabbies and stuff like that. That's what that is. But then they have this other level, which British society have this too, by the way, and to some degree American. But in India, just as it was frowned upon for the higher classes to work, and it was frowned upon for the lower classes to try to advance their situation, as it was called. In India, these people, this lowest level, were so far below the pyramid that you didn't even touch them. Literally, you didn't touch them. You didn't associate with them. You looked at this sweet. These people, they either did very mean beggars, and they were the Dalits, the untouchables. It says street sweepers and latrine cleaners. That's true. They did all the nastiest jobs, but they also were the beggars and the diseased and the lepers and the poor. If you want to put it in a Christian context, these are the people that Mother Teresa cared for, or the
Mm.
Dalits, because she was, I think, Hungarian originally. I might be mistaken, but she went from Hungary into her order, and she had found out about the Indian caste system and was horrified and wanted to go to help. So she went over to help, and she took care of the Dalits, the untouchables, and that was her whole life was devoted to that. So yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, that kind of gives us an idea of what he's talking about, because he's making a comparison
Mm.
between this really rigid caste system in India and this not so rigid but certainly unmalleable system in Britain. And what a remarkable difference we have in America. Now, in America, we have the poor. There's no doubt about it. We have people that are downtrodden and who are addicted to something, and who are And then we have people that do menial jobs in America. But the real difference in America, is twofold, I think, if I can expound for just a minute. In
Yeah.
America, we have twofold things. One, the difference is we have not looked down on trades and even nasty trades. We haven't looked down on that for hundreds of years, almost since the inception of America. If you read a text, which I know was written in the 20th century, but Johnny Tremain, okay, Johnny Tremain tells the story of a young kid who learns how to be a crafter and pewter, a pewtersmith, and he experiences all these other trades, and eventually he becomes great in the American Revolution. But what that book was showing, even though it was recently written, is that from early on, people who did trades like woodsmen and cleaners of the streets and all this associated with other people of different levels of society, um, without any friction, with very little friction. I mean, in America, yeah, there was sort of a carryover, that British, like you're obviously lower class thing. Yeah, it did carry over. But very quickly, we recognized that people of a low caste, if you will, were valuable, that they contributed equally to the American Revolution and to the culture of America as did the upper class. You had a guy, for example, who dragged the cannons from a fort in Canada back to help support George Washington's army. This guy was a bookmaker. I forget his name. Very large man. He was quite rotund, but he was he's a lower class guy, bookmaker. That's not a very exalted job. But here he was contributing to the American Revolution, and Washington, who was royalty, Washington valued him like anybody else. So
Mm-hmm.
in America, early on, we did not have a caste system that was as rigid as it is in India or Britain. But second, I think in America, we have always had the opportunity to advance our situation so that we have a very large middle class. It's not a pyramid in America as much as it is sort of an oval. We have the very wealthy, many of whom have got their wealth either through nefarious reasons or else through just working hard. And then you have a very large middle class. The majority of Americans are in that class. And then you taper off to the lowest of the low. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not this bulk of peasants in America, although that's what's being told us right now by a great many subversive voices. The fact of the matter is that in America, our pyramid is actually more of I don't know what it would be, uh, a gourd, a football. It's a football. That's what it is. It's a football, the American football. So anyway, that's a long way of talking about the difference that I think he's getting at
Right.
here in the text. Let's go back to the text here. I'd like to go back, if you don't mind, in the
Mm-hmm.
text. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay, I shared this. Let's go back to the text for just a sec, because there's some things I want to cover from earlier. I really like this bit about the Hindu system, and I had not known it, and I want to talk about that. But I want to go back for a minute to medieval Europe. So most of the time that people talk about classical education, I find that they have this mistake that is frequently made. They talk about classical education and they mean medieval education. And both classical education and medieval education in the modern mind are incorrect, which is a hard sell when you're trying to encourage people to adopt the classical model. You can't go in and say adopt the classical model, but it's not classical and it's also not what you think. It's not really a good selling point. But this is what they're talking about: is the seven liberal arts. Now, why do I say that? Classical education, as he points out earlier, is that Greek model and then that Roman model. The Greek model did encourage free thinking and philosophy, but there was never a formalized form of education. It was always like the peripatetic school, where you walked around, or it was like the Lyceum, where you gathered together. Um, and it did encourage free ideas and free thinking, but it also encouraged to a certain degree learning certain material, and it encouraged some recitation. But the main goal for most of the educated people in Greece was to be able to orate over things, to actually be able to lead and command and that sort of thing. So that was their goal. Then in Rome, you had the formal education in these little schools, these little local schools. And that formal education was designed in order to create great speakers and senators. And that it was normally done by a master who would then hand over the rote part of it, the memory part of it, to pedagogues, to slaves. And that's where it makes the statement about the slave punching it in, which I really like, that instituit pedagogos doce magister. The master creates instruction and the slave pounds it in, right? But as he says, free men in the concept of Athens, especially, were never slaves; they were never pedagogues. But then we get, Rome falls. We're glossing over history. Rome falls here. Caesar's murdered. Then you move from the republic to the empire. The empire trucks along for a while. Then you have the incarnation, and then you have the fall of Rome, which never really fell. But the culture transfers to become first a Merovingian dominated, which is Frankish, that is the Goths. The Franks dominated, and then came the Carolingians after that. And that's in Charlemagnus, Charles the Great. So when Charles the Great takes the crown and puts it on his head there in the 800s, actually he's crowned by the Pope, and you have the schism from the East, that's when you start getting what are called these cathedral schools. Okay, so the cathedrals, because there was no formal schooling. Charlemagne didn't have formal schooling at first, and certainly not before Charlemagne. What Charlemagne does is he creates what are called the scriptoria. The scriptoria were schools where people were encouraged to copy down manuscripts that already existed. And so you would hire people who knew how to copy, letters. Basically, it sounds strange to say this, but they knew how to write stuff. And you would copy down documents that were considered to be worthwhile copying. And then you'd ferret those away and you'd copy another document, so on and so forth. So you had whole rooms full of guys sitting there copying out these documents. And of course, they would be the lettered people, people that knew their letters. And at the same time, then you had these schools that were financed by dukes, but also financed by bishops, more likely. And the bishops would create eventually what were called these cathedral schools. And the cathedral schools were getting together in order to train young men, again, not women, to train young men how to think about a situation, analyze it, and debate it, and also to copy down the older material. So they're copying down the old material, and they're learning how to debate and question things. And the methodology, and they still exist, by the way, Cathedral School of Holy Trinity and St. John the Divine. These are just examples of this. You could look up Cathedral School of Holy Trinity or St. John the Divine, and you get a sense of what these cathedral schools are, because these two schools, and there are others, are pretty much unchanged from how the methodology they used back in the 1300s, 1200s. When the schools then developed, they developed a methodology that was designed in order to get people to think about a subject matter. And it says here that from them derived all the schools of Western Europe, at least in principle. And yeah, that's true. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the schools, the cathedral schools, and their methodology when we're talking about classical schools. The methodology they used was called the seven liberal arts, because they were the arts that freed a person, they freed the mind. And they consisted of the first section were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So he says dialectic here. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric were the three roads, the trivium, the trivium. And then you had, after grammar, logic, and rhetoric, you had something to practice on, which was the four roads, the four different areas of study. And that was called the quadrivium, or the quadrivium. And that consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Notice, by the way, that what you were focusing on was all mathematics stuff, because obviously arithmetic and geometry are mathematics, but music is mathematics. And astronomy is also mathematics. So they were really focusing, they were really training the minds of these young people by training them to think about mathematics stuff. Now, that's not where the schools stopped, but that's where the general education of most young people that attended schooling stopped. After the 4 years of studying arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and by the way, I'm not sure whether the one came before the other. The trivium came before the quadrivium. I think that the way that Joseph Pieper talks about it in his great work, they were simultaneously taught. Like you were learning grammar, rhetoric, and logic while you learned arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So the 4 year, if you had a 4 year division, it was based on the quadrivium, the 4 levels. But um, and that's where the general education stopped. And then it went on for certain people who were particularly good. It would go on for them to start collating and analyzing the texts that were copied in the scriptoriae. So all those documents that had been copied under Charlemagne's time now existed. And people reading those texts who had been trained in the quadrivium and the trivium began applying their minds to think about how do these things relate to each other. So they would sort them and they would put like with like, and then they would say, well, this guy differs from this guy. How do we reconcile them? Mm. And that process of analyzing and comparing and sorting and qualifying, that was the majority of the early part of the scholastic movement in Europe. Before we get to that business, though, these three, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, what are these works? Because we talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric a lot in classical education. The way that most classical schools have this concept come down to them is through the great author Dorothy Sayers. And I really admire the heck out of her. I think she's a wonderful scholar. And I love her work, The Mind of the Maker. It's worth reading. And her mystery stories are phenomenal. And she wrote a great play about the life of Christ. So she's no small bacon, she's really quite good. But I think she messed up on this because in this work that she wrote about classical education, it was just a toss-off essay, actually, called The Lost Tools of Learning. You can get it online. You can read it. The Lost Tools of Learning, she outlines a possible route to revivify earlier schooling, like grammar and grammar schools and out through high school. And she classifies it as grammar, logic, and rhetoric school. So basically what she's saying is that grammar is where you're learning basic A, B, C, D, F, G, learning to read, learning to decipher. Rhetoric is where you're just beginning to question things and find out stuff. And then, logic is where you're beginning to question things and learning the higher level stuff. And then rhetoric is where you're really debating stuff, talking with one another. And our correspondence, to some degree, Sarah says, is in the lower schools, that is K through 6, maybe K through 5. And then the logic is the 6 through 8, maybe 5 through 8. And then the rhetoric is the 9 through 12. So most classical schools, when they set up their classical school model, they base it on Dorothy Sayers' divisions, and it's almost like you're painting a shellac over what already exists, which is the lower school, middle school, high school. You're painting a shellac over it, calling it by pretty names, grammar, logic, and rhetoric school, and basing it on Dorothy Sayers' interpretation. But unfortunately, she's wrong, which is throws a wrench in things. Her analysis, although valuable, is not actually what the medievals were doing. Because when they talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric, they mean something slightly different. And I don't remember whether I put this in a note here or not. Here we go. Yeah, how about that? Gatto is wrong here. That's kind of a good note to follow. Grammar dealt with precision in language. Knowing the inner grammar of anything allowed understanding of the thing. So when we talk about grammar and the study of grammar, we're not just talking about learning your ABCs, like in Raising Arizona, right? He knows his ABCs. Fart. Yeah. If you know the scene, you know the scene. Um, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is we're talking about, and I misspelled grammar here. What we're talking about is we're talking about the inner language of this thing. It's what constitutes the thing. That in grammar is learning what actually is the thing that makes that thing tick. So in many ways, you're learning this through mathematics. You're learning the inner workings of mathematics, but it could be the inner workings of how a tree makes food. That's a grammar. You're learning the grammar of horticulture when you're learning how xylem and phloem work. You're learning grammar when you're learning how politics actually operates and how laws are made. You're learning grammar when you're learning, like, how do you construct a musical piece? That's learning the grammar,
Mhm.
because you can't talk about the thing unless you know its parts, how it ticks, how it operates. And at the core of this was a philosophical discussion about the nature of things. That is, what makes a thing and its thingness. The word for that in Latin was quiddity. And they talk about, and when you read medieval documents, they talk about quiddity all the time. The quiddity of this and the quiddity of that. That's a grammatical study, because what it is quid means what in Latin. So quiddity is the whatness of the thing. And you would study, like, what makes a dog, right? Is it four legs and fur? Because that's a tiger too. So what makes a dog? What is it about a dog that makes it doggy? What is it about a chair that makes it, well, cherry? That's learning the quiddity of the thing, the inner grammar. And it was more of a trying to understand the pattern of the divine that infused the physical world. So when the medievals were studying this, and by the way, we're talking about people that were studying this and then going on to really study on a higher level and discuss it on a higher level. So it wasn't this wasn't just localized in young students. They began the process, which carried on later until you became an Abelard. But you're studying what makes the inner thing. What is the quiddity of the thing? Once you learn the quiddity of the thing, you learn its logic, which is the logic is, how do all these pieces fit together to make this quiddity work? How does this thing relate to other things? How does it work in its environment? There's a logic to the universe. And by logic, they meant, on the one hand, formal logic, which is actually a study of how thought works. That's what formal logic is all about. But they also meant a study of what was called the logos in ancient Greek and then medieval. And logos means the pattern of the universe, basically. So you're learning the grammar first, then you're learning the logos, the pattern of the universe. And then the rhetoric was, how do you express to others what you have learned? How do you just express the structure of the thing?
Hmm.
And rhetoric had, you can still find websites that outline formal rhetoric, and it's really brilliant to look at. One that I like is the Sylvan Forest website, which has this outline of formal rhetoric. And rhetoric really is amazing to study, because you learn all these nuances and techniques. But rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to persuade other people to your path. So when we're talking grammar, logic, and rhetoric, we're talking about a formal study, a training in the ability to look at the structure of the universe, the structure of the logos itself. And as a quick side note, if anybody's listening, the logos is normally translated as the word, especially from John's gospel and arche ho logos estin. The word was in the beginning, and the word was with God, and the word was God. And we normally take it to mean the Christ, which is a Greek word meaning the anointed one, who was in time and place, Yahshua Bar Joseph. That
My
is,
movement or not. And I can't
what's
hear
that?
you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Not at all?
Let's see, maybe a refresh will help.
Or is that me? I am trying to make sense of what's going on here. And if people can't hear me, I hope it's not on my end. That's a problem. Go back
I'm
and talk about
back.
the grammar. Right? Okay,
Yes.
hi.
Yes.
What point did I cut out?
So you were just saying if anybody's listening and you were making the
Oh, right.
point about the logos, how usually it's that's where you froze for me
Okay.
anyway.
If anybody is listening, what I'm talking about here is the logos, and logos is normally translated as the word, as in John's gospel in arche hi logos estin, which is in the beginning the word was with God and the word was God. The word is normally associated in history with Joshua Bar Joseph, who in Roman or Latin is Jesus, whom
Mm-hmm.
we normally refer to as the Anointed One, which in Greek is Christus or Christ. So Christ, Jesus, is the Word. And so the medievals said when you're studying this grammar, logic, rhetoric stuff, you're studying the structure of the universe, the Word, the Logos. And you begin practicing on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and then you start moving to other things.
Mm.
So it's a little bit more complex than what Gatto lays out, but that's okay because I know he's trying to make a point, he's trying to make a thesis. If anybody's interested, the works to look at, I think, are Pieper, Guardini, or Riccavi. And let me just pop those up just real quick so we can see those titles, if you don't mind.
While you're getting those up, I just wanted to say that that breakdown you just did, that discussion of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, I found to explain something that not many classical educators or proponents of classical education can explain very well.
Yeah.
And it made sense of something to me that I hadn't really understood for, a few years now. Because I think that a lot of the discussion centers around, well, our divisions, our divisions of our different classes, our chemistry class, our literature class, our math class, really are artificial divisions. And we really should be weaving philosophy, theology, literature throughout all these different disciplines, that philosophy should be included in things like this sciences, for example. That can be, it's not necessarily that that point is wrong, but it didn't help me understand what the medievals were actually doing in their version of what these people are talking about with grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But I found your explanation to actually be really helpful. So that made a lot of
Hmm.
sense to me.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Good. I will say that we are in a bit of a pickle in American education, partly because
Mm-hmm.
there's so many people that want to destroy it or change it or use it as a tool, partly because of what Gatto outlines, and also just because of the bulk of history. We have a lot of different subjects that have accrued to history over time.
Mm-hmm.
John Dewey was no help because John Dewey basically said we should not only teach all these academic subjects, we should also teach plumbing and carpentry and car maintenance. And perhaps that's for a different time to talk about that when we have a better internet connection. I don't
Sure.
know. But given that we have school systems now that have to fit their curriculum so that their kids can actually get into college because that's what everybody wants to do. Or we have school
Mm-hmm.
systems now that have to prepare kids for the workforce because, of course, that's where you make the money, not in being a social activist from Harvard. Um, and then we have schools that want to teach all the classical subjects without recognizing that all the classical subjects were not all the classical subjects forever. You know, history was not even a formal study until a certain point, and certainly not poetry. Poetry wasn't studied. So yeah, it's a tough situation. And if you're in charge of a school and you have to make these decisions, God bless you, because you're going to end up making enemies. The second you say, I want my kids to study without grades, I don't want any grades attached to their learning. Well, you're going to have a lot of flack. Believe me, I lived through it. Trinity School tried to do that, and they still try to do it. And
Oh.
it's a tough road to hoe.
Hmm.
Or if you say, I only want my kids to study literature and philosophy. Well, what are you going to do about science? And what are you going to do about math? And what are you going to do about religion? And what are you going to do about, this, that, and the other subject that has to be studied? It's going to be a tough thing. It really is. I think that our discussion here, especially through Gatto, hopefully will be valuable just in being able to know what we're up against. It may not offer solutions, but maybe it'll show us what we're up against, and that might be a good step in the right direction. I would recommend, I always recommend lots of books. So pardon me, Jen, and pardon me, everybody else, if you're watching for recommending way too many books. But I would recommend the following books if you want to find out about the scholastic thing, which is an absolutely fascinating point in history. So here's the first. Hopefully you can see this. Um, the first is this,
Yep.
Joseph Pieper's Scholasticism. And it's a really well-written book. Anything by Joseph Pieper is gold, but this one he outlines very well, not just the rise of the scholastic movement, but then the crisis that it came to in the late 1200s. So that's worth reading. I think this book also is valuable. If you can see this one, right? Romano Guardini.
Hmm.
Romano Guardini says, when I read this, I thought the end of the modern world is like, yeah, the modern world, which began in the Enlightenment period, is coming to an end. Guardini says the modern world began in 1276. That's a long way to place the modern world, but he's talking about the split that occurs there in the scholastic debate that creates the modernist vision of the world, and that modernist vision lasted for 600 plus years and then is now coming to an end. We're living through it right now, this end of this thing. And that might be a good discussion later on as to what Guardini actually says. I think it'd be fun to read that one. But this is well worth reading. So I highly recommend The End of the Modern World. I also recommend this one, which is out of print, but that you can get it through Amazon as a reprinted text. This is by Joseph Rickaby. It's Scholasticism. It's a really nice historical account of the figures that went through here and his treatment of the major figures who are like Abelard, Duns Scotus, Thomas Aquinas, of course. Um, he really shows you who these characters were and what they thought and gives them good credit without coming down hard on any one of them and saying this guy's bad or whatever, this guy's lousy. He just really does a great job of outlining what these guys were like and what they talked about and that kind of thing. So I highly recommend him. I also recommend two others before I get back to the text here. This text here by Corbett, Edward P.J. Corbett. This is a classic. And you'll see the price tag, $183. I'm like, it's like a new car. I think this is because it's probably used in colleges still. And so they jack the price up, because colleges are what they are these days, which is basically a scam. You can get it used, but classical rhetoric for the modern student, Corbett does a fantastic job of outlining how rhetoric works and the tools of rhetoric and the old way of teaching rhetoric. So it is worth reading, and it's a very engaging read too. It's not dry. At least I didn't find it that dry. So, maybe I'm dry. That one, and then finally this one, which is The Elements of Rhetoric by Ryan S. Topping. And this is if you're very interested in learning about how to write and speak, writing, especially speaking. This one helps a great deal because he talks about how all the techniques you can employ in order to be clear in your writing and persuasive in your writing. And it's a very, very fine guide, I think. So I would highly recommend those 5 books, and we can put them in the liner notes later on too. So let me stop this share. Good. And go back to John Taylor Gatto, because I have 1 or 2 more things to say before I shut my yapper. Dad, what I want you to do right now is shut your yapper. So the first one here, I love Gatto. I love the way he writes. There are some things that he writes, I'm thinking, you're just wrong. Johnny boy.
Hmm.
You just wrong. So I just wanted to clear up a few of these. He says this shift from emotion to intellect resulted in great skill and analysis in the scholastic movement, in comparison and contrasts and classifications and abstractions. Yes, it does. The scholastics were famous for their analysis, their comparison, their contrast, their abstractions. The whole of the Summa Theologia, for instance, is a result of the scholastic attempt. And you would have a professor like Thomas Aquinas who would hold court on things, and his students would scribble down what he had to say, and then they compiled with the scribbles and they made it into the Summa Theologia. And what he would do is he would be addressing major questions that came up through his research of the various texts. This people say no, this, and this people say that, but I say this. And then we'd use things to support his opinion. So a great example of the result of scholasticism is his text, as well as others of his like. So yeah, they're very good at this sort of thing and very valuable to have. But then Gatto says they were famous for verbal hair splitting, like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. I can't let that go. That's actually a fiction. That's a myth. They never debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. That doesn't exist in any documents. It's a myth created in the 16th century, the 1500s, to
Hmm.
denigrate medieval scholasticism. It was primarily a Protestant creation, England, the English thinkers and writers. Such debate never occurred, as I said. But what in the 16th century, under Henry VIII, who had broken from Rome, Henry was trying to create a positively English society without any taint of the earlier European, um, primarily Latin and French culture. He actually created the whole study of Anglo-Saxon language and revivified the Anglo-Saxon language, which had been in innovation for many years. But he also created, well, he didn't personally, but during his time was created these myths that put down the medievals. Because if you're going to be an advanced society, you have to be advanced from somewhere. So the English society under Henry VIII was the paragon of human existence. And it was that paragon that had been achieved out of that dark, horrible period that we call the medieval era. But that simply isn't true. The medieval era wasn't this dark, horrible period. There were periods that were very dark and horrible, like the 14th century. I mean, that was a disaster of 100 years, but that's a different story. But the whole idea that the scholastics sat around debating things like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin that's a pure fiction, as much as the Iron Maiden fiction, which, if you know what that is, it's not the band. It's the whole idea that the people that were torturers in the medieval era used these horrible torture devices, which were which were all creations. They were props created in the 16th century. There never was an Iron Maiden in the medieval era any more than there were
Hmm.
other horrible tools. They were all created. And funnily enough, they were put into Madame Tussauds museum for the nobles to walk through and gawk at, so you'd pay money to come and gawk at these things. They're like, oh my gosh, the medievals made this and did that horrible thing. And ooh, it's terrible. Aren't we glad we're not them? Which I find it truly amusing. No, scholasticism didn't debate that kind of nonsense. And I asked this question, I said, a bit annoying that nothing much more is made of this remarkable era of the 9th and 13th century by Gatto. I get it. He's making a point and he doesn't want to linger. But what was the scholastic debate? What did that schooling lead to? And how did the thing that they were doing lead to this debate? I think for our talk, which is a talk about the education in America, I think it bears some scrutiny to at least go over what exactly was being debated in the medieval era, in the scholastic era. So if you don't mind, I'm going to be very brief here, but I'm going to try and give a quick synopsis of what actually was debated. Is that okay with
Yeah,
you? All right.
please.
Let me pause and see if you had any questions at all before I launch into this.
No, no, this is useful. I remember reading that scholasticism book in high school, actually at Providence, but I don't remember much about it, so it's useful for me to have the reminder.
Did I assign that to you?
Maybe it was you. Someone did. I
Maybe it was
recognize the
Bill.
book and I have it.
Maybe it was
Yeah,
Bill.
I
Maybe
don't
Bill
know.
would, yeah. Or maybe Arthur. Maybe Arthur Hipler did. I don't know. Anyway, good. I'm glad you read it. Um,
I mean, I was supposed to have read it. I think I read
yeah, I
some
know,
of
I
it.
know,
I
I know,
hope
I know,
I
I
did.
know.
I
Hey,
remember
believe
some
me,
of it.
the number of books that I was reading in high school and early college, yeah, sure. Didn't even need the internet to cheat at that time. Um,
True.
okay, so what did the scholastics debate? Now, as I've said earlier, they emerged from the scriptoria of the Charlemagne era. And those people were writing, copying down stuff. Once you copy down all these different texts, then you had to compile them. You had to sort them and say who wrote what subject matter was being approached. So this is sort of like a giant cataloging experiment. Once you had all that sorted, then you got guys that were comparing texts one to the next and saying these are both authorities, right? Aristotle and Plato are both authorities, but this guy says this guy says that. How do we reconcile them? And by the way, Aristotle came later, but that's because he had been lost and he made his way through the Muslim Empire and through Spain and back into Europe at some point and influenced the scholastic debate, but that's a whole other thing. In their discussion of these ideas, what they were ultimately getting at, though, was that they were talking about, as I said, the logos. They're talking about the structure of the universe. If this guy says the universe is that way, and this guy says the universe is that way, whom are we to believe? And so they were trying to then synthetically bring these things together. And this is just for clarity's sake, this is not the later thesis, antithesis, synthesis that we get from the communists. This is not what that is. This is more like we're really trying to pursue what the universe, the structure of the universe is. And so we have this guy, we have that guy. How do we reconcile them? But ultimately, what they were really attending to was, I think, a mathematical debate. It was a debate about the nature of things through a mathematical lens. And what I mean by that is one can talk about how 2 + 2 = 4, or one can talk about how, 5 or 10 divided by 2 is 5. You can talk about that. What is difficult to talk about is whether or not there actually is a 2, or to talk about what 5 really means. If, on the one hand, you think that 2 is a language for understanding something that is beyond this world, a metaphysical thing, that's one belief system, if you will. So one way of looking at the created world. If you believe, on the other hand, that 2 and 5 are constructs of the human mind in order to sort the physical things in front of us, that's a radically different way of looking at the created world. The one says that the things in the physical world follow a pattern that existed a priori to the physical world, and that structure is a large structure, infinite structure that we are studying. Call it the mind of God, if you will. Call it the logos, whatever the pattern. If, on the other hand, we're saying it's human construct in order to filter the physical world. But there may or may not be anything beyond this world that actually this physical world is structured on. So the one camp which says these things really are connected to an otherworldly existence, they were called realists because they really saw things as connected. These things were really connected. Reality is a metaphysical reality, and we process through this physical world, but we are seeing the whole time manifestations of a metaphysical world that we express most readily in mathematics. If, on the other hand, you see the world as, mathematics is a construct of the human mind, there is nothing beyond this world. And although it does matter how we interpret the physical world, our interpretation can be changed, altered, influenced. It's malleable because we might choose something else to interpret this same world. Those people were called nominalists because they said that the thing represented a physical object in name only, nomen in Latin, nominalist. So the realists and the nominalists were the two camps of philosophy that came head to head during the scholastic debate. That's what they were debating, not how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. You could say it was an existential debate. It was a philosophical, theological, existential debate. It wasn't just a trivial thing over here. And people like Abelard really, I mean, he was a powerful thinker. The guy is really a genius, but he held that the classifications of things were purely physical. There was no metaphysical necessarily. And that although it's important that we sort things correctly, we are just using a language in order to sort them. And that's all there is, just the physical world. People like Thomas Aquinas, well, let me get it before I get ahead of myself. People like, I forget the guy's name suddenly, but it doesn't matter. He held that basically this world was connected to another world, and he came up with a great theory that God is that which then nothing greater can be said, can be thought. He thought that we were connected to this other worldly thing. And Thomas Aquinas, who people revere, sat kind of in the middle of the two. He tried to reconcile the two camps, and he was making pretty good progress with that, but then he died. So these two debates, these two groups were having a very healthy, rich debate. But then it got infused with Aristotle, that even made the debate even more heightened. Because, of course, Aristotle suggests that what we're dealing with is simply the physical world. That's kind of part of his Nicomachean ethics. And because the debate was rising to this level, certain people in power saw that this could be very threatening to faith in general. I mean, if you think that the physical world is all there is, what do you do with all this talk about the metaphysical world? All that becomes simply human construct in order to understand the physical world. But there isn't any metaphysical. It doesn't really exist. There is no God. There's no spirit. There's no afterlife. All that is a language to understand the here and now for one camp. Scared the bees out of certain people. And I think that they put their foot down. They said these things are not going to be taught. They're not going to be discussed. They're not going to be thought about. And they tried very hard to control the debate from on high. And there was a series of things that could not be taught. A list of an edict that basically forbade these things to be taught in the universities that were controlled by the church. So that was in 1278. And it was under Archbishop Tempier, who was the Archbishop of Paris, most powerful university at the time. And when he outlawed those things to be talked about, they were primarily in the realm of the nominalist camp. Oxford followed suit because Oxford was the same basically entity as the Parisian school. And in 1278, they forbade those same things. And suddenly all these scholars who were in the camp of the nominalists were kind of out of a job because they couldn't go on talking about and thinking about and considering on the line that they were considering. So where did they go? They all went to Germany and to the German schools, especially the emerging schools like what's the one in Hamlet? I lost the name of it. Yeah, Martin Luther also came from this same school. But I can't remember the name of the school suddenly. My mind is getting old. They all went to these different schools in Germany, and they were backed by the German princes who wanted to find a way to put a wedge between themselves and Rome. And that's part of the investiture controversy that was ongoing at the time. They wanted to have a reason to claim that they had an equal amount of power to Rome. And they were backed by these great scholars who came, I mean, really powerful thinkers who came and supported their universities. At Wittenberg, at Wittenberg College. And they cranked out good thinkers, but thinkers who were primarily nominalist thinkers. And we see that fallout occurring as late as the play Hamlet, where Hamlet is actually graduated from the College of Wittenberg, right? Which implies that he has been infused with this nominalist thought. Parents now are like, I don't want to send my kid to this school or that school because they're just going to come back as some crazy pink-haired idiot. Um, sorry, pink-haired idiots. I don't mean to be too offensive because you got to be an idiot. But at the time, it was like if you go to Wittenberg College, you're going to come back with a rainbow sticker on you, and we don't want that. And so they were worried about that. And yet here's Hamlet. He comes back to Denmark, and he's filled with nominalist angst. That's the thrust of the play. Is there a God or is there not a God? Is there a ghost? Is there not a ghost? Did my uncle kill my legitimate father or did he not? Anyway, that debate between nominalism and realism has come down to us into the modern world, and we still see it now. It was a split that was so devastating that we're still feeling the fallout of it some 600 years later, which I find quite fascinating and much more powerful to think about that as an influence of our school system than the angels dancing on the head of a pin thing. So, although it was sparked by my own sort of knee-jerk reaction, I think maybe it yields something valuable.
I wonder if that's what's at the heart of this raging debate with the Odyssey right now. Do you think? Do you think we have nominalists and realists who are holding the two different lines?
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said about that
Hmm.
because uh, nominalism and realism taken together make a healthy mind.
Yeah.
When they split from each other and you're purely a nominalist or purely a realist, you fall into some serious danger. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, I get it. Nominalism leads to disbelief in the metaphysical and atheism and dissolution and drug addiction and living under a bridge. Yeah, I get it. But realism isn't much better all by itself because what realism falls into is doctrinalism and naivete and ultimately trying to control everything through power and submission to powerful forces that will guarantee that the streets are clean and the trains run on time. So realism without nominalism is just as dangerous as nominalism without realism. And I think both camps, when they go into a piece of artwork like the Odyssey, the movie The Odyssey, are going to see what backs up their position because they're unwilling to entertain the opposite. When a bird flies, it flies with both wings, not just with one, because that would be pretty stupid looking. But
Hmm.
if it's going to fly with both wings, it has to, if we can extend the metaphor, it has to, on the one hand, say there is a world beyond this world to which our world adheres. And at the same time, say there's only this world. That's all we have. The one causes the other to ask questions about the other constantly. And there's this debate, this questioning, this thought, which really propels the whole thing forward. But if you're preconceived to fight the battle to say, yeah, there's a metaphysical world and nobody's ever going to change my mind and it's exactly this way and I understand it, it's inside a box and shut up, you're going to see exactly what you want when you walk into a piece of artwork like that movie, The Odyssey. Just as if you say, there's nothing but the physical world and all we have is social disturbance, and fighting the good fight and liberating the downtrodden. That's all we have. Well, when you go into the Odyssey, what are you going to see? You're going to see the downtrodden and the liberation of the downtrodden and the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeois. That's what you're going to see. So I do think that there's a lot in this current debate about the movie that can boil down to this split. Are you a nominalist or are you a realist? Or are you a bird that has two wings? That's my
Hmm.
opinion.
Which is much of Odysseus' work in the story, really.
Isn't it though? Isn't it though?
Mhm.
There's a great point in the Odyssey when you see the movie, by the way, where Calypso says to him, in order to get home, you have to let go of control. You have to
Mm-hmm.
give yourself to
Yeah.
Poseidon. And he gets on
Mhm.
his little raft and basically he drowns. I mean,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes. And then he washes up on the shores of Ithaca in some magical, mystical way. Yeah,
Mm.
stop trying to control the thing all the time. Maybe our job as humans, maybe our job is not to understand every little jot and tittle. I don't know. It does seem to be something to be worth considering at least. Or maybe you can put it even better. Go see the movie before you judge.
Mhm.
Or go and read Thomas Aquinas before you judge. You know, it could be well worth it. All right. Anyway, he goes on to do the Platonic ideal, which I think I'm going to save for next time because I've talked a lot, and I think I'm done with that business. So let me check and see if there's anybody who might have swept into the chat room. Oh, I've got all these tabs open. Um, and see if there's anything that we need to address. And if there's any other question that you might have too,
No,
on
I
this,
think I
because
think we covered quite a lot, and
yeah,
I'm
a lot of
grateful for the
ground.
reminder of the scholastic debate.
Mm. Well, next time I do want to get into that Hindu thing because that's fascinating to me. Not just the Hindu influence on American education, because you never would think that, right? But the whole influence of the English domination through the Opium Wars, the Malthusian thing, because there is a level of Malthusianism that
Mm.
Gatto even refers to. I think that's all well worth considering when we're trying to make sense of what's going on. So maybe we can plan to tackle that next time, perhaps. Sound reasonable?
That sounds very good to me.
Awesome, Jen. All right. Take care. And if you wanted to stay on after the live stream, we could talk about Friday if you need to. And if not, that's cool too. Okay.
Sure, that's fine.
Excellent.
I'll stay on.